How do you impress people at a cocktail party? You talk about regulatory takings because, well, that's sexy. Actually, do you know when your property is condemned by the government, they're supposed to compensate you for it? Unless they only take a little bit, then, or a percentage, then they don't. To talk about this from the Farm Bureau, Shawn Martini, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
And an actual farmer from an actual farm who raises cattle, Carlyle Currier. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. You guys have an initiative on the ballot. It's a constitutional change. And you need to explain the problem before you explain the remedy. So let's start off with you.
Sure.
What's the problem you're trying to solve?
The problem, it's complex as you mentioned, but the problem itself is very simple, and that's our Constitution protects us and has broad protections for private property. However, courts have given themselves the power to interpret away many of those rights. So when land is seized, you are compensated. But unfortunately, when the government...
If I've got a big swath of property, like some farmers have property, and they put a road down the middle of it, and they take this for a public purpose, they condemn that land. They say it's worth this much. Here you are, Caldara. Here's the money. We just bought it from you. That's condemnation. That's a taking. That's takings.
That's correct.
Right.
There's another kind of takings, which is the government does something, typically a law, a regulation, that diminishes the value of your property. And unfortunately, our Constitution is very broad, but courts have defined that down so that the government effectively right now can take more than 90% of the value of your property and not have to compensate you for it.
90%. So we're not putting a road there, but we're saying you used to be able to use that stream you had there, and now you can't. Or you used to be able to do this, or you might be able to do this in the future, or we've zoned it in a way now you can't use your land.
Potentially, it's any number of things that a government could do that's specific to one landowner that prohibits them and diminishes the value of their property.
Before you get into what your proposal says, give me an example from a farmer's point of view, a rancher's point of view, what this looks like in practice.
Well, a good example in a cow-calf or a cattle operation would be a confined animal feeding. When I wean my calves, I put them into what we call a feedlot to hold those calves and grow them before we're ready to send them to be finished a larger feedlot for eventual production into meat.
So in other words, this is like nursery school, basically.
Yes.
Before you put them into high school, you put them in nursery school first.
And you know, a feedlot naturally is going to have a certain amount of smells. There may be some things about that feedlot that may bother a neighbor.
I get the same smell down at the Denver Capitol, so I know what you're talking about.
If a local county passes a land use proposal and says I cannot use my property to feed my cattle in that way, that would be a taking, because that may be the highest and best use for that particular parcel of ground and maybe the best place I have to do that with my cattle. And if the county says I can't use that portion of my land for that purpose, that would be an example of a taking of value. They might also say I can't raise a crop there that requires a certain type of pesticide to be used, like an orchard, and I can't spray it. If they say that, so I can't raise an orchard there, that would be a diminishing of the value of that particular land, so it can't be used for that.
Perfect example might be up in my neck of the woods where the Boulder County commissioners are saying, no, you have to grow GMO-only foods, GMO-free foods on this, even though that's how you've been farming it for generations. Right. Now you have to change. That's going to cost me. That's going to cost me money. And what are you going to pay me for that? So
yeah, that's absolutely right. If you're raising sugar beets and have been for years, but the only sugar beet seed you can get is GMO seed, and the county says you cannot raise GMO seed, well then you can no longer raise sugar beets there, and that may be the highest and best value of that ground, and it's going to reduce the value of your lease on that ground and the value of that land because you can't raise sugar beets.
So the Farm Bureau has backed a constitutional amendment that'll be on this fall's ballot that does what exactly?
It adds language to the Constitution to say that if property is diminished in fair market value by government law or regulation, that is a compensable taking.
I heard you say words, but I don't know what you just said.
Exactly. So that's the text of the language. What it means is, in looking at the entire suite of sideboards that the court has put on very broad constitutional language, the Constitution currently says private property shall not be taken without compensation. They put a number of limiting principles on that. One of those principles we think is particularly egregious, and that's what we're after with this language. A lot of them are common sense. The one that they have set allows governments to take 90+% of the value of your property without having to compensate you. That's what we're targeting.
So in other words, you own this property and the government says you can no longer farm what you're farming, you can no longer ranch what you're ranching, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do this. You could still have the property, but the value of that property goes away. That also, I assume, is for mineral rights and what's under your property. So if you're mining and you're getting this sort of stuff, and they say, no, you can't mine that anymore, that would be a taking.
Potentially, yeah. There's a number of things, right, that add to what is the market value or contribute to the value of a particular piece of property. The Constitution doesn't distinguish between what those types of values are. If something is taken away from you, the government is compelled to provide compensation.
So the Farm Bureau has been taking the lead on this. How big is this for farmers? I mean, we all rely upon you for our food, but to be honest, we don't think about you. We're in the big city here. We don't think about you.
It's a very big issue for us farmers because we need to be able to operate our farm in a way that's economically profitable to keep us in business. And if there are regulations passed that don't allow us to do that, that take away that right we have to farm, that can stop us from being able to continue to operate our business and essentially cause a farmer to sell out for development or some other use.
All right, let me be skeptical here for a second. There's another issue on the ballot here on fracking. And if it passes, it falls very well into what we're talking about because farmers, ranchers, miners, people own land and they have mineral rights underneath these lands. Mm-hmm. If there's a change to law that says, fine, you used to be able to extract minerals, oil, gas from it. Now we just passed a law that says you can't. I'm assuming that would be covered under this as well.
Potentially. One of the things with these cases is they're very fact specific, right? And so you change small facts about a particular case and all of a sudden the court looks at something and says, well, no, that's not actually eligible to be compensated for. I think there's a case to be made that should something like that happen now under current law, you could make the same claim.
I mean, the
idea here is, again, they can now take 90% of your property, 90% plus. That's unfair.
If I was to boil this down into hypothetical, just for theory. So I've got this big hunk of land, and it's worth $1 million. This hunk of land, but really it's worth $1 million because of the oil rights. If I didn't have the oil rights, it would be worth $100,000. Mm-hmm. And so, therefore, if you say you can't use your oil rights that you had yesterday, but we've taken them away today, mm-hmm. You've just taken my land and you've destroyed 90% of the value of it, which is okay, if you feel that's important, government, but you've just condemned 90% of the value of my land, give me the money that I would have made from that. Mm-hmm. Roughly what we're talking about?
And certainly the potential for that. I think the courts would have to decide whether a ballot initiative, is that an action by government or is that an action by the public? And I'm not sure this ballot initiative directly addresses that issue.
But it opens up the possibility, that a landowner could finally state his case in front of a judge and have at least a shot at
it. That possibility is currently there. But again, unless it's 90% or more, there's really no way to make that claim under current court precedent. That's what we're trying to nudge them off.
All right, so let me go to the other side of this. Your friends who run cities are losing their minds over this proposal. All right, so the cities are going, if you pass this, we won't be able to do anything. If we want to do a zoning change to our city and rezone, certain neighborhoods from high density to medium density, we're going to get sued by each and every one of these people. It will bankrupt us. This is a heyday for lawyers. Mm-hmm. Is it?
Not at all. No, the folks that are making that case are either ignorant of how the takings law currently works, or they're being deliberately misleading. And frankly, they've got an interest in maintaining the current status quo because they are not responsible for compensating for taking value away from property owners. There's a number of things, as I mentioned before, that the courts have done to limit this and put sideboards on it. That's why we don't have the situation that they are saying is going to happen in the future now. Our proposal only looks at that one piece of limiting judicial precedent, which is that they can take 90+% without compensating you, and saying, you know what, you need to look at that again. That's not fair. All the other limiting principles remain in place. That's not disputed. So there's no reason to think that the Chicken Little sky is falling scenario that they like to paint is going to happen. It's scaremongering. It's what you do when you run a no campaign.
I can understand, Broomfield is always on the verge of putting in some sort of fracking ban, and other places are doing so. And that takings could then become a possibility. And this way you could regulate somebody out of existence. What about the argument that a regulation might hurt you or help you, but because I'm next to you, it's going to devalue my property. So you're not going to get rid of that grazing lot that smells so bad. The smell is going to make my property worse. So I get to sue the city because you have too many cattle.
I don't think this bill will do any change at all to the current right to farm legislation that most counties have and we have in the state law. So I think, once again, it's very unlikely that that type of scenario would be involved here. It's still going to cost enough to go to court and file a claim that you're not going to have frivolous lawsuits brought by farmers against anyone writing regulations. It's got to be pretty well proved that, easy to prove that there is a definite loss in your value, or you're not going to spend the money doing that.
How do you sell this to voters? Because you're talking about something that, as a policy wonky guy, I look at this and go, this is an issue. This is a problem that is being exploited in Colorado and needs to be fixed. For me, it's clear as can be. But for the average voter, this is going to be a little tricky. How are you going to do this?
Voters get this.
Voters do?
They very much understand. The government can currently take 90% plus of the value of your property without having to compensate you for it. They understand there's a problem there. We got 208,000 signatures from across the state of Colorado in order to get this thing on the ballot. A lot of those people thanked us for that. They were able to participate in the process. They said, this is important. We need to be able to vote on this in November.
Is all this backed by the Farm Bureau? Is farmers' money coming in? Anybody else helping you out?
Farmers' money is in there as well. The Farm Bureau has contributed to our issue committee. The Farm Bureau has.
Farm Bureau, okay.
This is backed by our policy that we've had on the books since any one of us can remember. And we're bringing this to the people of Colorado to try and fix this problem.
A few seconds left. People want to get some information. Where do they go?
You can go, first of all, to coloradofarmbureau.org. You can get on our website. There's information there. There's also contact information for contacting for Shawn, for myself, for many of our other leaders that you can contact.
Farm Bureau. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thanks
Thank you.
us.
Read me in the Denver Post. Listen for me on KHOW Radio. Tell a friend, and we'll see you next week.